Good morning. We continue our journey in conclusion, a review of the conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis. We are on page 1407. Aleph Tov Zayin. Very fundamental section, and actually quite profound. There's a lot of thought to understand where souls are rooted. As I think I mentioned in a previous class, you can mark these pages as one of the few places in Chassidus we actually have more elaboration than usual on the process of where Neshomas generate from, essentially the genesis and the birthing of souls, if you wish, all the way in the highest levels. Now we know God created everything. The Torah begins, God created everything. Heaven, earth, everything in between, all the physical worlds, the spiritual worlds, the tzimtzum, pre-tzimtzum, everything originates from the Creator. So there's one Creator, and everything else that's created has its own personality. And God created, being that He's not just one, but He's beyond one, He can also have the capacity to create infinite multitude of different creations. Some are called Bria, some Yetzira, Asiya, Atzilus means it's an emanation, it's not a full creation in the sense where created a new reality, but as opposed to that, it's an extension of godliness, if you wish. But when you go deeper levels, you come to a point where there are creations like we discussed, and then there are things that God imparted a piece of Himself, so to speak. Obviously, all this is limited language. It's hard to speak in English, in a simple in human language. How do we describe a part when it's not really a part? Because it's not the entirety of Atzmos, as we'll learn today in this class here in the parentheses. But nevertheless, there are still things that God creates, like an artist creates a piece of art, and there are things that are of the very DNA of the artist, like a child, like the artist's child. You can't compare a biological child of a human being to the piece of art that they create, or a book that they write, or any other production that they produce. So in that sense, the Neshomas are rooted in the deepest levels because they have and therefore they have the capacity to fulfill the mission for which God created existence in the first place. So existence is created b'shvil, like we say, bereishis, beis reishis, b'shvil ha-Torah and b'shvil Yisrael, which means that the neshamas using Torah would come into this world and transform it into a home for the divine, adira b'tachtein, as I explained more detail yesterday. So in that sense, what you have is basically the neshamas and Torah precede existence, and in that itself, we know that some places Torah is seen as higher than neshamas. That's when the neshama comes down below and is concealed in a dark world, and therefore it needs Torah to so-called fan its flames and reveal its true power, the neshama's power, and also guide the neshama like a light, a guiding light, Torah Ohr, in this dark world, because the eye without light cannot see, so it needs the siyua of Torah Ohr and the Einei Ha'eda, the leaders that use Torah to serve as a guiding light. But then there's the neshama says they are higher than Torah, all the way in the highest root, not as they come down below, where they are rooted, and there the neshamas are higher than Torah. And that's what he's been explaining in the last few pages, what that means. And in that sense, what we have here is a connection, as he says, and just to go over what we learned, the details, starting with the Eitz Chaim on the top of page 1406, going to where we are right now, 1407, the Eitz Chaim explains, Yesh nitzuz kotem me'eit shu b'chinas alikus nimshech madrega achrenes shu bebeireh. That's unique to a neshama. The neshama, there's a very small spark, which is a likus, that manifests in the nimshech madrega achrenes beir, from the lowest level of the beira. What does that mean? The lowest level means it's not the complete beira. It is a piece, so to speak, but not all of it. But it is essentially a part of the Creator itself. Because the creator could have created, always good to understand it by contrast, he could have created existence without giving a piece of the creator in there. Like I said, an artist doesn't have to give his very DNA into his art. His art is a reflection of him and his vision and so on. But it doesn't have to be necessarily a piece of himself, so to speak. Even though we would say in every piece of art there is a piece of the artist, but that's more metaphorically speaking. In essence, when he gives birth to a child, the child has his very DNA and his genetic makeup using this human example. But it's from nitzutz, from nimshach madrega chenesh shebebeda, the zeh hanitzutz, and this spark, mislabish b'koyach nitzutz echad nivra, mislabish, which means gets enclosed, manifests within, but it's definitely in a type of mislabish, meaning it's going now down to a next level. As I pointed out, you have here the beta, you have the nitzutz ma'ed, kot ma'ed, that comes from the madrega. You have the madrega chenesh shebebeda, you have the nitzutz kot ma'ed that comes from there. And that, in turn, it manifests in another nitzutz, which he calls b'koyach nitzutz. Well, I don't want to call it another nitzutz, another spark. He doesn't say that. He just says zeh nitzutz mislabish b'koyach nitzutz echad nivra. So the word b'koyach echad nitzutz nivra can be explained in a number of ways, but in practical ways say that spark, in turn, manifests into a spark of creation now, not creator, because remember, this is now I'm entering into the world of creation, the highest levels. He says, Ak of Adam de Bria, Shehi Neshama Daka b'me'ed ma'ed. So this is the highest, this is the first place where Neshama is defined as a very, in ma'ed ma'ed, extremely refined or subtle or sublime, however you translate Daka, and that's called Yechida. That's called Yechida. And in this nitzutz, Hanikra Yechida, Yesh Bashar Shedal Pchinas. That includes the root of the other four levels of the soul, another meaning Chaya, Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh. That's the language in the Eitz Chaim. Then he goes on to explain how that is the difference between these two levels in Neshama, as it Yechidus Kolul is the Arich, and the higher level as it draws down from the Nitzutz, Cotton Beta, meaning Tachtena Shebebeta, Tachtena Shebemaitzel is like Atik. And then he goes on to explain the difference between Torah and Yisrael, where Torah is Arich and Yisrael is Atik. And then further, that Primus Torah is also Atik, and Yisrael is even higher, the Atik above Ak. I'm not going to go over that because we learned that. Then the paragraph that we are now in the middle of, that begins at the bottom of 1406, he says, now let's connect it back to the language of Neshama Shenasata bi Tahirehi. Earlier we learned Tahira is Atzilus. Then we learned that according to the Kabbalah of Rab Chaim Vital, it is the world of Ak. And Chassidus explains that Tahira is Tahira Ilah in the levels before the Tzimtzum itself. There's a Tahira Ilah and a Tahira Tata, one that relates more to the creator beginning to envision existence, Oliver Sene. Then there's Koydem Alei Sarotzen. That's the level of like Atik. The first is like Arich, and that would be the Neshomis, Koydem Alei Sarotzen. And he calls that Oliver Machshava. That's what arose in his thought. Arose also means an aliyah, meaning a madrega aliyena Machshava, even preceding to the Machshava that creates existence, which is Alei Sarotzen. And here's Ali's Oliver Machshava, which is Tehiri Ilah, as he puts it, and he gave other terms for it. This includes the Igul HaGadol is Tehira Tata, that's Alei Sarotzen. Before the Igul HaGadol is the Ein Sof, that's not even a mocker of a mocker to existence, that's Tehiri Ilah. Another explanation he gave, another parallel he gave to that was Atik and Arich, as well as Machshava and Dibur from the Maimon L'Kutei Torah. Machshava and Dibur. So Dibur is associating, Machshava is still within himself. And then in the parentheses, he says the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. So we have a lot of references that when you go back in Ayin Beis earlier or other places in Maimorim, you can see how it all comes together. You have here 5, 6, or maybe more references to these two levels that we're discussing here. Then he adds that there's actually 3 levels when you break it down. The 3 levels of Atzmus in Ohr. Ohr Shekolul B'Atzmusei. So you see here, we're always talking about something that's not Etzem Mamish. it's either the kolul batzmusay al derech moshel koyach hiyuli atzmi. Koyach hiyuli atzmi is like the example of the faculty. It's not even coming to a defined faculty that's even hidden. It's completely hiyuli. It's a potential within the core. So you can't call it even a mitzias, but we call it kolul batzmusay. The second level that comes in hamshacha klolis. Now there is a hamshacha. That's Ein Sof Shekedim Alei Saratzen. So now he's adding the third level, that there's something even prior to the rising of the desire for existence. And the third is Alei Saratzen. So Alei Saratzen is what's called Kadmin, which is the Ein Sof, like the Eagle HaGadol Tehira Tata, that is beginning to envision existence and actually allocating resources for it. It's still before the Tzimtzum. Shir b'keach kol masha osid liyas b'peil is the expression he uses from the Mikdash Melech. That was a commentary on Zohar. Prior to that is koydem alei sarotzen, is the mere fact what he called before yiridas v'amshachas ha'atzm. Well, I don't want to say which level it is, but koydem alei sarotzen has not yet arisen in his desire, so it's not even a mocker of mocker. Till now he's been saying that's the neshama. And then there's even higher than koydem alei sarotzen, koydem alei sarotzen, which is kolul batzmusay. You can't even call it kedem alei sarotzen. And these are the three levels, yochid, echad, kadman. Now, the next piece he said, so here's where we now understand it even on a deeper level. So with neshama is, till now we've been saying that neshama would be echad, and Torah, or let's call it existence, would be kadman. Meaning the two levels, tiri law and tiri tata, before the tzimtzum. I don't want to mention Torah actually, because Alei Saratzen doesn't say explicitly is the level of Torah. He does, it seems to indicate that, because he did say Torah is more connected to Arich as a blueprint. But the truth is, Pnimius HaTorah, as we learned, the Shashuim Lefanov, so you have to say it goes even deeper. So this can be discussed exactly where Torah belongs. But let's first finish with the Neshomas before we get to Torah. So now he's adding this third level, and he's saying, based on the Eitz Chaim, that there's two levels. There's Yechida, that's the Neshama, that would be the level of Echad, which manifest in Yechida are rooted in the Yachid, in the Nitzitz Cotton, the first Nitzitz, the initial Nitzitz Cotton that comes to Madreg Achrein Shebebeda, which he's defining as Yachid. So as such, what you have now is that we have essentially two levels in the Neshamas itself. Besides the Neshamas as they come down below. But Roshi Yitzat Afasisiv or Ata Barasa Ata Yitzat Ata Nafachtabi, those three levels, that you could say is Kadmin, is the level of the Neshama as it's already, like Yechida encompasses the four lower levels, like he said, in the Eitz Chaim. Then there's Yechida itself, which is the Neshama that at the level of Koydem Alei Sarotz. And now we're saying that it actually goes and rooted even higher in the Yachid of the mitzvah's cotton, which is the madrega achreina shebebeira. So based on this, you say there's like three levels at the soul. The first level I wouldn't really call the soul, like I explained yesterday, because the Eitz Chaim says the neshama, dakam ba'ed ma'ed, is already the level that's receiving from the nitzutz, from that small spark, which is the lowest level of the beira. So you can't really call it a neshama there. Well, you can say the neshama is rooted there. And that manifests within the neshama, not like a creation, but he did say. Well, actually, I should correct myself, because he does say b'koyach nitzutz echad nivra. Yechida he calls it a nitzutz echad nivra, not nitzutz beira. So chassidus, there is a concept. There's a language you may see in some places that neshama is a lakush shenasi yesh. Interesting expression. Everything in the world in existence is called a yesh. It's of substance. It has an identity, it has definition, and it's as I said before, a creation of God's. What level creation? There's different levels. Some are more focused, some do have an identity of their own, when you talk about lower levels. Atzilus, for example, the spheres of Atzilus have an identity, but they're not of their own. They completely are absorbed and completely consumed with being Iyu v'chayu echad, Iyu v'garmu echad. It's God's chesed, it's God's gvura. Chesed and Gvura and Chachma Bina of all the spheres and Atzilus are simply instruments and channels of God. Like the Merkava, they have no identity of their own. When they evolve into Bria, they begin to have their own so-called independent identity. But you cannot say they have no identity because chesed means chesed. It's the chesed of Hashem, not the gvura of Hashem. But that's already, if you go before the tzimtzum, that would be like the 10 hidden spheres, which he described before, is actually the level of the level like of kadmin, because there is spheres, but they're hidden because they're like still concealed in the hot coal. Then we go deeper than that. So that is all what I just described are all the levels of that's the levels, the lower levels. But then you say Lakusha Nashi Yesh is not a Lakusha Boida Yesh. It means that the Lakus itself has become a Yesh. You could say, I don't know if I've seen this anywhere, but you could say that's the meaning of the Eitz Chaim, where he says that the nitzutz of the Boreh becomes the nitzutz of the Nivra, because he says it's mislabish. Mislabesh is b'keich nitzutz echad Nivra. In different words, that's Elokus. Nitzutz cotton of the tacht madrega achreina sheba Boreh is manifesting within the nitzutz of the Nivra, Elokus and Asiyesh, and that neshama will then travel through all the worlds. The Tehedehi ata barasa ata yitzat ata nefachtabi ata meshamre b'kibri into this world, empowered by this divine essential power that it has to transform existence, and that's why it can transform existence. You know, like we say, you cannot solve a problem from within the system where the problem originates. And the neshama does not come from the system; it comes from higher than the system. The yesh comes from the system. Aleis HaRatzon creates the structure of existence. But a neshama is rooted all the way in a place that's pre-system, if you wish. Not just pre-tzimtzum, pre-system altogether. Even pre-kedem Aleis HaRatzon, and even higher than that now, all the way in the Yachid. So it's carrying the Yachid of the Nitzutz Echad Boreh. And that neshama will then have the power to come into existence and introduce a whole other dimension that existence on its own does not have. It was created by the same Atzmus, obviously, but it doesn't have that personality, and definitely not in a revealed way. And together with Torah, Neshama has the power to achieve that goal. So that's somewhat of a summary with a little more explanation of what we've been learning here. And as I said, that's what he's saying, the Yesh Lemer, this last Yesh Lemer, it's just cotton that comes from Matrega Achreya Sheba Boreh, is the Yachid that's higher than Yechida. And that is this highest level that's even higher than Kedem Aleis HaRatzon, what he calls Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei. Now remember, this is not Atzmus, this is Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei. In the language of the Eitz Chaim, it's Madrega Achreina Sheba Boreh, that's the Nitzutz. But as soon as you say Nitzutz, remember, Nitzutz, you say spark, spark means Ohr. Spark is not an etzem. A spark is a spark, and he calls it nitzutz koten me'ed shubchinas alakus. It's interesting, the expression nitzutz koten me'ed, even though it's madrega achen sheba Boreh, he still calls it a very small spark, and that's why it associates madrega achrena, because obviously it's not atzmus, and even when we say madrega achrena of atzmus, it's still called a nitzutz koten, and that nitzutz will then manifest or enclose. Mislabeshes is the actual expression into the nitzutz. The nitzutz, kayach nitzutz echad nivra, and that's which is the neshama daka b'ma'ed ma'ed, which is called yechida. Okay, so when we say etzem neshama, when we say, for example, Yom Kippur, etzem neshama, so often that means yechida, that the yechida of the neshama is touched and is revealed. Prayer of Yom Kippur, the fifth level, ne'ilah. Especially the end of Ne'ilah. But as I explained yesterday, Yechid is also Chamisha Shemes Nikra. There are 5 names that the Neshama has. So there must be something higher than Yechid, which doesn't even have a name. That's like Etzem Neshama. Now, is that the level of Koyach of the Yachid? That's the Koyach, that's the Nitzutz Echad Boreh, or is it clearly that has to be that level, because the next level he already calls Neshama Dak Meid Ma'id, that he calls Hanikri Yechida. So that can be discussed exactly what that means, but the bottom line is it's definitely rooted in these highest levels. And now we're going to learn a little more about this, and it'll be more understandable, the parentheses, and then finally the end of this paragraph. So this is a summary of what we learned yesterday, and I would wait till we finish if you have questions, because there are more details to be laid out here. Let's learn those details now, and then I'll stop, and I'm happy to hear any questions. But if someone is very impatient and wants to ask something, but by all means, I'm happy to try to answer. But as I said, it may be more understood once we finish the parentheses, this parentheses on this paragraph. Okay. Does anybody want to comment or ask anything on what I've just said? There's a pretty heavy discussion here.
Well,
is the Yachid a Ohr HaKolul be'atzmusoi, or the Yachid is higher than that? It's
based on what he says here, based on what he says, what we learned here, it sounds like that's the Ohr HaKolul be'atzmusoi.
So that's not Boreh. That's not Boreh.
He calls that Boreh. That's what it seems like he's saying. It's not called Boreh. Madrega achreina shebeber. Nitzutz echad. Nitzutz kotem ma'oid. Shu b'chinas alakus. Nimshach madrega achreina shebeber. He doesn't call it Boreh. He calls it madrega achreina shebeber. So it sounds like Ohr HaKolul be'atzmusoi, based on what he just said, the three levels. It may be higher, but I can't say something conclusive. Based on the logic of the structure of the Rebbe Rashab, that's what it sounds like.
Now, what's Yechida?
Yechida, he just said, Yechida is the next level. Kadmon, not Kadmon, Echad.
Yechida is... Ohr HaKolul be'atzmusoi kifi...
No, in each time he says... Are you looking inside?
No, I don't have a
I think you need to look inside the text, because it's very clear in the text. Yechida is the Nitzutz Echad Boreh, which is Madrega Achreina shebeber, is then mislabeshes benitzutz b'koyach nitzutz echad nivra called Yechida. I mean, you just look inside the text and you'll see it's two different levels.
No, is this oil not...
The higher level is Ohr HaKolul be'atzmusoi based on this, and the next level is Ohr Kedem Alei Sarotzen. Yechida is Kedem Alei Sarotzen. And there's a Yachid Shalamayla Miyachida. I suggest you look inside. You'll see the structure as he explains it there. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. I have a simpler question.
Yechida is mekabel from Yachid. Yachid is mislabeshes into Yechida. So based on what he's saying here, the three levels, it would seem Alei Sarotzen is already, as it relates to existence. Kedem Alei Sarotzen is Yechida. And Ohr HaKolul be'atzmusoi is Yachid. That's what it appears from what he's saying here.
Maybe Ohr HaKolul be'atzmusoi is Helam or Atzmi. You
can say whatever you like. The Rebbe Rashab doesn't say that. At least not here. Why would you bring a language? If he wants, the Rebbe Rashab is not bashful. He used the word Helam Atzmi. He knows when he wants to use it. You want to be patient. You'll learn more about it. We'll talk about this later. I'm talking about what we're learning right now. What it says here is what I just described. It doesn't mention Helam Atzmi yet. Helam Atzmi is Negeya, but not right now. We'll talk about that later.
Is the Neshama Yachid?
I don't know what we're doing here.
No,
I don't know, but the Neshama has many
Yachid?
levels. There's Neshama that is Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya,
no, the highest
Yechida,
level.
and Yechida receives from Yachid. You heard what I said? Neshama has 5 levels. And Yechida, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, they're all encompassed within Yechida, and Yechida receives from Yachid, which is the Nitzutz, the Madrega Achreina shebeber, the Nitzutz Echad Boreh. Nitzutz Kot Ma'ed Boreh, what he says. That's how he explains it here.
That was very helpful.
Okay. Any other questions?
Rabbi Teitel, are you finished?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to ask a simpler question. When we say in Tanya that the Neshomo is a chelik delakam mal mamash, what aspect of God is this Elokah? Because this, that we just learned, is suggesting that the Neshama is rooted in a small spark of God, but it's not a small spark of God itself. It's the Yechida is rooted in Yachid, which is the Nitzutz Katan. So I'm a little confused because I always thought the Neshama, the soul, was actually a little tiny piece of God himself, rather than rooted in a tiny piece of God himself.
Why can't it be both?
Well, okay.
What
so
do you think?
we...
When you say that the Nitzutz Katan Ma'od of Elikus, which is Elikus, that's God himself, right? Madrega Chen Shebebeda, right?
Yes, correct.
And he says that's Mislabeshes, that
in
manifests
yes.
in what we call Neshama Dakaba Ma'ed Ma'ed. Why can't you say that's the meaning of Chelik Elakam Mamash?
What we just did. It's clarified now. I guess it's just a much more precise explanation than saying
let's go back to Tanya. In Tanya, he says that it's like a child that comes from the Etzem Moyach Ha'av, right?
Right, like a teapot. Yes.
Okay. So the child is not the father, but the child comes from the Etzem Moyach Ha'av.
Okay. All right. That's simple enough. Yeah. Thank you. Very clear. Thank you.
The key is that Yechida has in it if you want, the DNA of the Nitzutz Katan of the Boreh. That's for sure. How you exactly explain it? Is it a piece of it? Is it a spark of it? Is it the manifest? There's a lot of ways you can discuss and explain it, but that is clearly the dynamic here.
Yes, I see.
And the key thing is to contrast it with existence, because existence does not have that. Existence does not have Yechida, which receives from the Yochid, as he's putting it here. Mm-hmm. It's created by Atzmus. The Yesh is created by Atzmus. Everything comes from one Atzmus. But the question is what that creation
so
has.
So it's interesting. You could say that the Neshama is both
Elikus and Nasa Yesh.
Yeah, exactly. It's both Elikus and Yeshus.
Yeah. I said Elikus and Nasa Yesh.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's why it has the power to transform the Yesh of the creation.
Beautiful.
It's the DNA of Atzmus.
Exactly. And how you explain a piece and chelik, there's an expression yesterday, Rav Shlomo mentioned, the Baal Shem Tov says, etzem keshatatefus bechelkoi or b'miktsosei. When you grasp a piece of it, you grasp all of it. There's a lot of ways to explain how the neshama carries that so-called DNA, and on higher and higher levels. Remember, there is definitely a point where the neshama loses its entire separate identity. You can't even call it a neshama, because there's only one God at the end of the day. So as soon as you say neshama, you're already saying there's a God that imparted a part of himself, so to speak, into the neshama. But you're already speaking about a neshama. We know Hashem is a seamless unity, Hashem Echad, or even higher, Yachid, or even higher than that. So you have to say that there are levels. Once you go too deep into Asmos itself, the neshama, as much as the DNA of the child comes from the father, but then the child loses any of its own identity. Then it's simply a piece of the father. That's why you need to have, if you want the neshama to come into this world and change the world, it has to enter this world. It can't remain, because the Eibishter then doesn't need a neshama. He himself can change the world. Why does he need a neshama altogether? God creates a world and he makes his own dinner b'tachtein, but that's not the kavanah. He wants to send so-called his child, if you wish, a piece of himself that he imparts into the yesh, elikusha nasi yesh. This neshama travels through seder ishtalshlus. Atzmus is always there in the so-called, I don't want to call it in the background, but within it all. And the neshama is now activating its atzmus power with Torah support, siyua, to transform the world. That's the so-called the mechanics of it.
Yeah, beautiful. Almost like a godly agent, if you will. It's not.
Yeah, I use that word, an ambassador, an agent. Yeah. Those are all good words. Yes.
No, I would say that this is God himself.
You can say whatever you like, but it's not God himself, because if it's God himself, why do we need to talk about a neshama?
No, because that's the way that God brings himself
even
down.
Even chelik elakah memal mamish does not say it's elakah mamish. It says chelik elakah. That's the second half of the story. Because again, if it's God himself, he doesn't need neshamas to do this. He can do it himself. A neshama is clearly an entity. The question is how much of an entity, how much if you wish, what are its definitions? That's what we're discussing. Yechida is already, you're calling it a name, Yechida. And then there's where it's rooted from. Okay.
But the Rebbe does say that it's God himself.
What does that mean? How could a neshama be? Which Rebbe says that?
Our Rebbe says in the Dvar Malchus.
Can you Dvar Malchus? Yeah. You mean the Rebbe is saying something different than the Alter Rebbe in Tanya chapter 2?
No, but he's saying that Atzmos, this is exactly it. Like we have to come to
you'll look at the language in whatever you're reading from the Rebbe, and it's consistent with all of this. The Rebbe did not change what it says in Tanya chapter 2 and what we're learning here. So if you look at the language itself, I'd like to see a language that's different than what we're learning here. It's completely consistent. Is there a particular expression you want to quote?
Yes, I'll find it and I'll post it.
Yeah, you'll see. It's essentially this. This is the pshat. There's no other interpretation about a neshama.
But it makes sense because Hashem sent a part of himself into the Olam Ha'elem.
Anyway, I've been discussing in the last half hour, a part of himself is not himself. It's a part. It's a chelik.
No, I understand.
Okay. You can call it whatever you want to call it and explain it any way you want, but it's not atzmos. It's a part. Chelik, nitzutz echad, madrega achrena shebebeira. It's not beira. Beira is not madrega achrena shebebeira. And beira is not a nitzutz echad. Just keep that in mind. It has within it, like I said, a child has the very DNA and genetic material of the father, Atzmos Moyechav. Nowhere in any place in Chassidus or any Maimer or any Sikh contradicts that. What I just said is there's no two approaches to it. There are many ways to explain what that means and what that power is. But the dynamics, remember, the Eitz Chaim is that Arizal. No one's coming to change what that Arizal is saying. You can explain what that Arizal is saying. And again, the Alter Rebbe uses the word chelik elikav very precisely. Okay, let's continue reading now the parentheses. It'll help. And we're going to learn more about this. Not over yet. It's not over. And I want to say another thing, if I may. I keep saying this many times. You know, we become spoiled. We talk about atzmus like it's our body or something. You know, atzmus here, atzmus there, chelik atzmus this. You have to remember when the Alter Rebbe said atzilus, he couldn't even express it. He trembled. His voice stuttered. He couldn't say the word atzilus. Why? Because he wasn't saying a word. He was experiencing a level. That's atzilus, and atzilus is a far, far lower level than what we're learning here. So I'm not suggesting everyone here should start stuttering or trembling, but I want to just, at least intellectually, we should understand we're talking about extremely, extremely high levels, and we have to respect it. We're going into the Holy of Holies here. I'm not saying this as a critique. I'm just saying it to appreciate what we're learning here. And it's critical to understand that Chassidus is giving us a gift of giving us a peek, so to speak, under the dashboard, if you wish, behind the scenes, behind the curtain, what are things like before the Tzimtzum, and then before the Tzimtzum itself, all these higher levels. So you have to be very careful when you talk about these things. And the Neshama you can explain it very clearly. It's Atzilus, Ata Barasa is Bria, Yetzira, Ata, and then all the way to Asiya. Here he's taking us all the way back into where it first originated. And if you can't really experience Atzilus, do you think you're going to experience this? So we have the words, and we're definitely learning it. And I'm not suggesting we should avoid learning it, God forbid. But we have to also, while we learn it, understand you're dealing here with levels that are so beyond human experience and human definitions that we have to find a way to translate this into Avodah. Yesterday, I spoke a little about that. You asked the question, Rabbi Yitzchak, about how do you apply this? You know, the idea of you have that element of godliness within you. But you have to keep in mind, just to have that ability, to have a godly power to transform the world is a big thing. God did not endow that to other creatures. Animals don't have it. Vegetation and Tzameach, the world of Tzameach doesn't have it, and Daimim, the mineral world doesn't have it. So it's a very unique thing. And again, it has to be translated into an Avedic way to appreciate what it really is. So yes, we are learning about it in the highest levels, but we have to respect and understand with the reverence, the appropriate reverence, what we're dealing with here. So if someone asked you a very simple question, what's the difference between Atzmos and a Neshama? What would you say? You have to be able to answer that question. And it's very clear from the Eitz Chaim and from Tanya and from other places that there is a major difference. It's not the same thing. You can't just say Atzmos equals Neshama and Neshama equals Atzmos. You could say the Atzmos in its own mysterious way imparted into a Neshama, a so-called a piece of his DNA, as we're learning here, as we're discussing here. But this needs to be understood well, because remember, we negate the concept of a deity except God. Let's not forget that it's worshiping anyone and saying they're like God, that is called by us Avodah Zarah. It's not a small little thing. It's not like, okay, who really cares? You know, we actually completely reject Christianity's claim that someone is a son of the Father, and that is like the Father on earth. So I don't want to go into this right now, but how do you explain the difference between their theology and what we say about neshamas?
But it's not what I'm saying, because
anyway, I'm not speaking to you right now alone. I'm speaking about the whole big picture. How do you explain the difference? So you see here that you really need to have a very good appreciation of the subtlety of what Atzmos is. And when you look in the source, you see that Arizal immediately clarifies that. He says clearly, even the Neshama Dakamed Ma'id is already 4 levels lower than Boreh itself. There's the Boreh, there's the Madrega Achrena Shebeboreh, there's the Nitzutz Echad Boreh that comes from there. That's Mislabish and Nitzutz Echad Nivra, which is Yechida, which in turn encompasses the 4 lower levels of the soul. I just wanted to make clear that we're dealing here with extremely, extremely powerful, high levels. And when you talk about Atzmos, you have to be very careful, because you're dealing with Atzmos. I've said a number of times, the Rebbe Rashab says in Torah Shalom that when we say Atzmos, we usually don't mean Atzmos. We mean Ohr, like he says, Ohr HaKolul b'Atzmose, just for the record. Because Atzmos is built in Metzias Nimtza. It's a level that we can't, Moshe was told you can't see me and live, but it's more than that. It means you can't experience it and be you. So all that needs to be taken into account. That's all I wanted to just qualify what we're addressing here. You know, who we're dealing with. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, there's a parsha where the Yaakov lays down on the ground, and the Rebbe explains that he's laying down because the neshama and the guf are equal in comparison to Atzmos. For Atzmos,
let me just stop you here. If you're coming to bring a quote that contradicts what I just said,
no, it
I'd
doesn't.
like to see that quote.
No, it doesn't.
If you're coming to, so no, let me
I'm
just make it clear.
that I didn't think that
what
the
I
neshama
just said
equals
is
Atzmos and
what I
Atzmos
just
equals
said is not
neshama.
open for there are no different opinions on this matter. There are different ways you can explain it, but the statements that I just made are essentially, I'm quoting a Eitz Chaim, a Tanya, and the Rebbe Rashav's Maimer we're learning here. So if you want to show me a text, you feel there's a text that is different.
No, I'm just saying
it.
that I didn't say that the neshama equals Atzmos and Atzmos equals neshama. I'm just saying that I know that it's not, and it's in relation to Atzmos, neshama and guf is the same difference.
That's another discussion. Yeah. Okay. Fine. So let's continue learning. This is the parentheses. And the line that begins Hainu mebchinas yochid shalamayla mebchinas yechida on page 1407. The text can be seen at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow along. So it says va'ayim mashakosov ba'bir d'shcheira ani. He's telling us to look at the beer of Shcheira ani. There's a beer of in Likutei Torah of the Alter Rebbe. And it was brought also earlier in chapter 27 in Ayin Beis. The klol is b'chinas ha'eru, b'chinas ha'achrena shebe'ein sof. So now he's going to explain, I think what some of you may have alluded to, the concept. What are we talking about here? When we say madrega achrena, like he said here, and he's comparing that to Ohr HaKolul b'Atzmose. Remember, he said the 3 levels, he said, is yesh gimel madregas ba'oyer. One is kol b'atzmuse, called that yochid, which is higher than yechida. So now he's saying that in the bir neshcheira ani, he says that the general level of Ohr is called Achreina Shebe Ein Sof. So in other words, Ohr is not just a reflection of Ein Sof. It's actually like the lowest level of Ein Sof. That's what that means. We'll understand as we go along here, and we'll explain. V'shamavur, and that biur in Shcheirani, which is interesting. Shcheirani is going to be brought later in this hemshech about the neshama as a Shcheirani v'nava. I am dark but beautiful. The neshama says, as it comes down below, even though I come down below and I'm concealed, but I'm nova, beautiful. So it's connected to this whole idea of the neshama coming down and where it's rooted. So he continues, and there he explains the gam chinas hakoyach v'ayechelis. I will explain what that means in a moment. That also the level, what we call the koyach, the power, and yechelis, the capacity. And I'll explain the difference shortly. That's a level that the Alter Rebbe used on atzmos, yechelis ha'atzmos. It was a way of the Alter Rebbe trying to explain a higher level that's not yet Ohr, but it's also a step, so to speak, below atzmos. It's yechelis atzmos. It's God's capacity to do something. So even the level of koyach and yechelis, he says in that maimer, shezo b'chinas ha'er, some for the gam b'chinas ha'er, shezo b'chinas ha'er, v'shem hakol b'atzmusei mamish, that's the level of Ohr and Shem. Again, two levels: Ohr, light or energy, and Shem, name, the name of God. We'll soon discuss what that means. Hakol b'atzmusei mamish. And on this level, we say Shmoi is kadmen kikadmusei. It's a very high level. Why? Kadmen means it precedes everything else. Now, we usually say that only on Atzmos. Only Atzmos is the true kadmen. Everything else has a source, including the highest levels of Ohr, includes God's power, includes God Yechelis as well. His very Yechelis, his capacity, is Atzmus, the Yechelis of Atzmus. So Atzmus precedes it. So he says, but there's a level that carries the Kadmen of Atzmus within it. And that's called Shmei Kadmen Kikadmusei, U'kamei Shekosem Mizeh, B'drush Yom Tov Shalosh Reish HaMachvav Ye'un Sham. Like he discusses in the Drush, in the discourse of Samach Vav, called Yom Tov Shalosh Hashanah, because it began Rosh Hashanah. Reish HaMachvav is like Tov Reish HaMachvav, and Ye'un Sham, he tells us to look there. This is in the Maimer Vayelech Samach Vav, one of the most profound and fundamental Maimarim in Chassidus, where he talks about the Chiddush of the Alter Rebbe, that Ohr is Kadmen Kikadmusei, which means it's still not Etzem, it's Ohr, but it carries so much of the Etzem that you say it precedes everything, just like Atzmos precedes everything. And there are many explanations given for it. For example, just a very physical example. If you have a pole, right? A pole that is infinitely tall. So it'll cast an infinite shadow, right? Will the shadow be the pole? No, it's a result of the pole, but it carries the same infinite side to it because it's a shadow of the pole. So in other words, there are entities that are so bottled and so completely subsumed, you can say, completely absorbed or reflective of the etzem, that they carry the etzem's power, even the kadmin kekadmusei of the etzem. So this is now going into a very profound concept, of course, that God is imparting, so to speak, into Ohr and even koyach and koyach and yechelis, kadmin kekadmusei. This you cannot say about any creation. When you say God created a stone, or a tree, or an animal, even a human being, we'll talk about neshamas shortly. The fact is, they're all finite creatures. You don't say kadmin kekadmusei in anything. Nothing precedes everything like Atzmos precedes everything. And here we have a level that is called kadmin kekadmusei, shmei kadmin kekadmusei, as he explains in Samach Vav. I'll explain this some more this class and the coming classes. I just want to finish the parentheses at least.
Right now he's talking about Shem, not the oil.
He says both ha'er v'shem HaKolul b'atzmusei. So he's talking right now, he's combining both of them. They are different, but for all practical purposes, they're right now both Kadmon Kekad, even though it says Shmoy Kadmon Kekad, he says that about Ohr too. I said I'll explain that more in detail. Right now he's bunching it together. Let me finish the parentheses. One second. So he says Shom Avur that Gam Zehu B'chinas Achreina Shebemaitzel. So he says Ohr is called Achreina Shebe Ein Sof, and then explains that also Keich V'Yechelis, which is like the Ohr Shemo HaKolul B'atzmusei, Kadmon Kekad Musei, that too is called Achreina Shebemaitzel. Now you could be medayik here. It says Achreina Shebe Ein Sof, Achreina Shebemaitzel, but bottom line, he's saying they both are called Achreina, which is like the language used in Eitz Chaim, Achreina Shebe Boreh. He says Achreina Shebe Maitzel, the lowest level of the Maitzel, of Ayin Shom. So he's telling us to look there. Now I've looked up obviously and learned it. I'll cite more from the Likutei Torah later, but that's what he says. Mipnei. So why is it called Taka Achreina? What does Achreina mean? He says Mipnei. The reason for that is Ki loy zehu ikar elikus ma she'elam mishavim mimenu. Because that's not the primary goal or function, I should say. That's not the primary element of elikus, that the world should be created from it. And he also says the expression, I'm not sure why he doesn't quote it, loy ze ikar elikus she'nisava mimenu oir. So as much as Ohr carries atzmus in it, like Kadmon Kekad Musei, it's not the ikar of elikus to give off light. It's not the ikar of elikus to create this world, and that's why it's not. You can't call it atzmus or maitzel itself or Boreh itself. You call it Achreina Shebe Boreh. V'zeu b'chinas Achreina Shebe Boreh, and that's the meaning of Achreina Shebe Boreh. Why is it Achreina? Doesn't mean a physical bottom. Achreina means the lowest level, as of the lowest floor of a building. It means Achreina because it's only an external expression, where it's not the ikar of elikus. Atzmus is far beyond Ohr and Shem and Koyach and Yechelis and so on. Ayin Mashin is Boreh Le'il B'drushay Shvuos Ayin Daled Reish Ayin Daled. Down below they correct that to Reish Ayin Gimel, meaning he's referring to earlier here in Hemshech Ayin Beis in the Maimarim Shvuos that talk about that. Yeah. And that is, I have to, here they, on the bottom in the footnote, they say page 247, where he talks about that. And then finally, the end of the parentheses, the last two lines, the imken yeshlema. Now, what about neshamas? Where neshamas fit into all of this? If the neshama yechida is rooted in yachid, and yachid is madrega achreina shebe boreh in the language of the Eitz Chaim, so where neshamas fit in? So he says, "Imken yesh leimer." So based on this Likutei Torah, beer of Shcherani and Likutei Torah, we can say, that the root of souls is in the Shemo HaAtzmi, not the name of God as it's revealed, but as it's in its core. Mamish HaKolul B'atzmusei, as it's encompassed in Atzmusei, like he said, Shmoy Kadmon Kekad Musei, HaKolul B'atzmusei, V'chein Mavur B'drush Hanal. And so too it's explained in Samach Vov, in that Maimer Vayelach, V'ze'i and Olu B'machshava. And that's what it means, Yisrael Olu B'machshava. So before he said Olu B'machshava, he said was Madrege El Yenush B'machshava, Kedem Alei Serotzen. Now he's saying Olu B'machshava all the way in Shemo HaKolul B'atzmusei, which is the level that he said the first of the three levels, Yochid Echad Kadmon. The first is Kolul B'atzmusei. That's where souls are rooted. Sheiresh HaNeshamas. Because Yechida is rooted in Yochid, and Yochid is the Madrega Achreina Shebe Boreh, and that's where souls are rooted. I might as well finish till the end of the paragraph. So let me read a few more lines. Ubchinis Yechida. He goes now outside the parentheses. Hirak shemekabelis miYochid. The next level is Yechida. That's only that receives from Yochid. And Yechida is the level that encompasses all the levels of Giluyim, of revelations, like he said in Eitz Chaim, of the Daled Chinas of Chaya, Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh. But the core root of the soul, he B'chinas Yochid, Shalamaylam That's far higher than the level of what we could call a source. It's not even the level of a source. And this level, neshamas are higher than Teda. And they are mashpi. They are the level that is mashpim. They transmit and impart to Teda. They add to Teda, like we learned earlier, because now we're talking about the neshamas as they are higher than Teda and are imparting into Teda and contributing to Teda. Even though initially neshamas below receive from Teda its light to illuminate the darkness, the shcheirani. But then once the neshama is accessing these highest levels, then the neshamas are higher than Teda and mashpi into Teda. So we conclude here exact levels of where this neshama is located, so to speak, in these deepest and highest levels in Elikus. Okay, we'll stop here. And obviously there's much to unpack here and explain. Kayach Yechelis, and what does it mean? Gam Kayach, how is that different than Ohr and Shemo? So I'll talk about that in the next class, more detail. But I'm glad we were able to discuss. That's why I said this would add. So we understand very clearly here that he's talking the neshama is rooted in the level of echad is rooted in yachid. Yachid is the nitzutz echad, the nitzutz beta, the nitzutz katmeid b'chinas alakus from the madrega achrena shebebeta, and he explained also what means achrena because leize ikar alakus. So here you have clearly the distinction between atzmus and neshama. So can you say, for example, you say leize ikar alakus and savim men elamis, also referring to Ohr. And he doesn't say it explicitly on neshamas, because you could say, do neshamas carry the ikar of elikus, or are they also in the category of leiza ikar elikus? Because you could say neshamas, like a child, is carrying the very etzem of the DNA of the father. But you could also say that DNA of the father is also not the ikar of the father. The father is far beyond his own DNA as well. So that I'll leave for the next classes to discuss. Meanwhile, you can think about it. But he's clearly speaking here what means madrega achrena. It would be always helpful if you want to look into Likut Teda. I don't have the page number in front of me, but look at in Likut Teda Shir Hashirim Shcheirani. There's an explanation where he talks about this, and the Ayin Beis has referred to it before. As I said, chapter 27, and I believe later he's going to discuss it as well. So okay, so we'll stop here. Anybody has any questions, please, by all means.
Why should he say he could say that Ohr and Shemo b'atzmuso is not the Atzmus. It's a Gilui Retzoni. It has nothing to do with the Atzmus. Has nothing for himself. And if you want to say that this is the Neshama, that means that is
what you just said is true. But the Alter Rebbe says even more than that. He says, "Loize ikar elikus and esava menu elamis." He doesn't mention it.
That's about Atzmus, not about the oil. The oil is a Gilui Retzoni. The oil has
He's
no
explaining why is it called madrega achrena? Why is Ohr called madrega achrena? So he says because loize ikar elikus. He said that clearly. Because elikus is far. Because Atzmus is beyond that.
Okay, but if you say
the Moyer, Atzmus is beyond, is not the ikar to give off, to create or to give off light. What's not clear what you're asking?
Right. No, my question is, he said that the Neshama is the Ohr and Shemo b'atzmusoi. Ohr and Shemo b'atzmusoi is nothing. The whole power of the oil is because Hashem is giving it to him. It's not.
You're asking why he calls it Ohr and Shemo b'atzmusoi?
The Neshama, yeah. It's
because that's what it says. That's the explanation. What it says in Eitz Chaim. That's the meaning.
I'm trying to understand because the Neshama, if he's saying
what's that? Based on what your question is based on? This is the Rebbe Rashab speaking here.
I want to understand.
What are you saying? Do you have a place that says otherwise?
No, they're always saying that the Neshama.
Who's always? This always saying is a cliche.
Okay, forget about always.
That's why I asked you, who's this always? We have the Chelika Lekam and Malmamish in time.
In the class.
We have the Eitz Chaim. 1 second. We have the Eitz Chaim. We have the Alter Rebbe and Tanya Perek Beis, and we have now Ayin Beis. What do you mean always? Who says otherwise?
Okay, so forget about always. We just said before, you said it, that the Neshama is the DNA of Atmos. If we're saying that this is oil, oil is not the DNA of Atmos.
Who said that Ohr is not the DNA? Ohr is beferish, the DNA of Atmos is what he's saying. Who said what you just said? All Ohr is an expression of the Moyer.
But this is a nivro, not a nivro mamish, but Hashem, Gilui Retzoini, it's not instinctively
you feel Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei is an insult to be on
no,
that level?
I don't feel it's an insult. I heard what he said before about Atmos. But I want to know what the Neshama, I know what Ohr and Shemo HaKolul is. I don't know, but I understand. But
so
the
maybe
Neshama,
you have
I
to
think,
go
is
back.
higher.
He says these are the words inside. Etzem sheneshama b'chinas yochid. He says sheirish haneshama b'chinas shmoi ha'atzmi mamish HaKolul batzmusei. That's what he says. The fact that you have a perception otherwise doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct.
No, I'm not talking about myself. I want to understand it. That's it.
No, I'm saying okay. First of all, I understand your question. You're asking, isn't neshama rooted higher than Ohr, right?
Yeah.
But remember, we're not talking about Ohr. We're talking about Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei.
Yeah.
Which is Kadmun Kikadmusei. So it's not just talking about Ohr and Sophia. It's talking about the root of Ohr in Atzmus. So they just keep that in mind.
Kadmun Kikadmusei means that it has the power of the Atzmus. But what's
the difference between power and DNA? What's the difference between power of Atzmus and DNA of Atzmus?
And the difference is that the Ohr is not having any power. It has the power because you said it about song
well, if you look in Samach Vav, Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei is Kadmin Kikadmusei like Atzmus. So I see that. That's how he's explaining it here, which I tell you. If you have another place that says otherwise, by all means, we will talk more about this, as I said, in the coming classes. But don't dismiss Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei is not, as he said, is the highest level in Ohr.
Not dismissing.
We're not talking about Ohr HaMispashet or Ohr HaMeir LaAtzmei. We're talking about Kolul Batzmusei. That's a particular level in Ohr.
I understand. Why can't you say it's from Helem Atzmi, which is higher than Ohr HaKolul?
Why is Helem Atzmi better for you than Ohr?
Because it's higher. It's higher than Ohr HaKolul.
One second. Who said that? Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei. How do you know that's high? How do you know Helem Atzmi is higher than Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei?
We learned that. You said it.
It's not me. If it says in Ayin Beis, I'm happy to see it. But where do you get? How do you know? Maybe it's the same level. Helem Atzmi and Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei.
As far as I remember, we learned that, and everyone was so fascinated about this idea. And I'm asking you: is Helem Atzmi higher? According to what we learned from you.
If you want my answer, I would suggest wait, be a little patient. In the next few classes, we're going to discuss it very explicitly. The reason I didn't discuss it, since the Rebbe Rashab didn't bring Helem Atzmi, I wanted to be careful not to yet introduce that. It's a good discussion. I'm not saying to you that there isn't much to say about it. I would just suggest, let's wait. Right now, he said what he said. That's for sure. He said, Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei, Shemo HaKolul Batzmusei. Is there a difference between Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei and Shemo HaKolul Batzmusei, Shemo Atzmi? As I said, I will discuss Koyach, Yechelis. So this page and the next page, this will be discussed more at length. And we will refer to Helem. I will discuss Helem Atzmi. Just wait. Right now, this is what he says.
Thank you.
On the next page, if you want to have a little preview, you can say, he says, Shemo HaKolul Batzmusei hu b'chinas Helem Atzmi, just for the record. The question is that the same level as Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei? And that's why I'm telling you, Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei can include Helem Atzmi, because it's not Ohr, it's Kolul Batzmusei. It's God's power to give off Ohr, which is the same power to conceal. Remember, in Atzmus, they're all one. So just remember, that's why I don't want to go into it right now. It's a little more complicated than just placing it on levels here. But we'll talk about this. I assure you that this is a very important discussion, and we will definitely address it. I will also address the difference between Ohr and Neshomo. Because remember, when Ohr Ein Sof starts becoming actual Ohr, it's not the Neshama that comes down the mata in a guf and that has these highest levels. So even though Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei, but Ohr will have its own track and Neshama will have its own track. He's talking about the root of the Neshamas in Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei. But then they will each have their functions. As a matter of fact, Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei is going to be connected more to Torah Ohr, and the Neshamas are going to be connected more to the Helam Atzmi of Atzmus as they travel downward. But that, as I said, I want to leave that for later discussions because it'll be very confusing if I bring it in right now. Did you follow what I just said?
I did.
Yes.
I want to hear more, but not now. Too late.
Okay. We'll talk about it. Good. So let's stop here. End of the paragraph, page 1407. Trust me, this is heavy, heavy stuff. So it takes time and we learned it already, interestingly, and we discussed all this as well. If you go back to the recordings, you'll find we mamish discussed every detail we're saying here. I remember it clearly because it's so obvious that it all jumps at you.
We went into it deeper this time, didn't we? Or maybe I just didn't understand it at all. I completely blanked out because it was so confusing. Did we go into this level of detail the first time? I don't think we did.
I think even more, frankly.
Really?
It was just maybe the first time. So these things take a lot of time to really wrap your head around.
Yeah. Yes, they did.
It's fine. I don't remember. I just remember discussing it in very much detail because I no way I would jump through this without going into the details. So I don't remember again exactly the wording.
I'm sure my head was spinning. I'm sure you did. I'm sure I just didn't understand.
Do you think Kidmusenu has to do with Kedem?
Kedem as in what? The wine?
Kadmon? No.
Oh. Well, based on what he's saying here, it sounds higher than Kadmon. Even though Kadmon is a high level, but he said clearly the three levels in Ohr, Kadmon is already Eles HaRotzen. Here he's talking about Kadmon Kekadmusei in Ohr HaKolul Batzmusei, the first level. So even though that word is used in both, and that's interesting, I thought about it when I was reading it as well, but it's clearly two different levels of Kadmon. You have to understand what's the difference between Kadmon in level 3 and Kadmon Kekadmusei in level 1. Kadmon in level 3 could be most likely it precedes existence, so it's a Kadmon in that sense, but not necessarily Kadmon Kekadmusei. And the first level is Kadmon Kekadmusei. You compare it literally to the source itself. That would be my first initial contrast.
It's interesting that both Kedem and Kidmusenu, it's a different kaf and kuf, but they both have dam, and we're talking about the DNA, so it's interesting.
Yeah. Okay, let's stop here. End the paragraph on page 1407.